Hi, we continue in Genesis 29 today as Jacob has taken his journey, as you can see on the right side of the screen, starting at Beersheba with the one stop at Bethel, and has now made it to Haran. And we saw him engage with the shepherds at the well and shockingly tell them what to do. A stranger in town who's telling the locals what to do. Surprisingly, they didn't kill him or just push him away on the spot. But somehow he got past them and he got to Rachel and he kissed her without consent, as we saw last time, and now she's run back to tell her father. I wonder if she's telling him good news or bad news, but we'll hear in our verse 13, as you can see on the left side of the screen, what happens. So to catch ourselves up, I'd like to just go over quickly a couple of things that we've been looking at in this unit. And if you haven't watched the introductory video for this section on 28:11 to 31:55, I really encourage you to do so. We've been looking at the shape of the story around the two framing sections of Jacob and Esau, and our central section here is Jacob and Laban, and we're moving to the second unit of that here, which we can see around this chiasm that goes from 28:10 to 31:18, and now we're entering into the second piece of that. And after this discussion with Jacob and Laban, which will continue on the other side of the chiasm, we'll see the whole unit between the two sisters is its own form of chiasm. And as I've been noting throughout this section, this is because the whole story is cyclical, like chiasms are. So it's not an artificial construction on the text. It fits with the rhythm of the text itself. And as we've been looking at also, and it's really important today that we notice this, there are three levels at least of reading this story. There's the immediate plot that we've been looking at of Jacob escaping from his angry brother to look for a woman in the old country. There's the oracle of two nations in your womb that Rebekah got back in Genesis 25 that tells us that Jacob is Israel and his brother Esau is Edom, and we'll see more of that later. But now, as we saw in chapter 28 around the question of Bethel and its recollection from 2 Kings 23 with Josiah's so-called reform, now we have another element in this chapter, and that has to do not with what we see here, but with Laban. The word means white, and how that's associated with the Mesopotamian moon god Sin. And it's just a pure coincidence that the English word sin for doing something against God is similar to the Akkadian word for the moon god. So hope you can look past any association there, which is just arbitrary. And we're going to look at a few elements of that because that's key, that Haran, the city they're in, was one of the two major loci for the worship of sin. The other one being the city that Abram came out of in the first place back in or his father rather, Terah, came out of back in chapter 11. And as a number of scholars have noted, the path from Haran is known as the path of the moon. And I didn't know that at the time because I learned it from aspects of this book, which you can see here, published in 2021. So we'll look at that more as we go. We've also been looking at the key words, and we can see now that we're moving into this section here. This immediate part doesn't have a lot of key words. I highlighted son there because it comes up 3 times, but it's not really a key word in our chapter as much as daughter is, which we see here. So daughter, serve, and give will arise in the part we'll look at today. We'll stop with this part today, but plainly that's going to be the theme throughout this unit. Another element that begins to be relevant here, and there's not really one place to look at it, but throughout, is, as Spolstra has noted, and I put up the citation of that a couple of videos ago, and this chart is, of course, posted at radicalbible.net, of the elements in common here with the wife-sister stories that we saw in Genesis 12, 20, and 26, with Abram, then Abraham, and then Isaac. But there's also inversions of the pattern, as we're going to see here. So what's going on there in structuring this story similarly and yet very different from the previous wife-sister stories? Another thing we've been looking at, and I revised this compared to the one that was posted, so if you downloaded it already, there's a newer one posted now. These parallels between our story and the monarchy story, and these are many others, and these are examples from many others, and I added one that allowed me to repost this. Today we're going to see bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, bone and flesh there, but we're also going to see how Rachel is described in identical terms with David, and only a couple of other characters in the entire Bible are described with that exact same phrase. So I won't go over these in detail, but I encourage you to look at that as we go, because part of what's at issue, I'd like to suggest, is that Genesis, as an exilic and post-exilic text, is challenging those like Ezra and Nehemiah who assume that the return journey to Jerusalem will involve reestablishing the Davidic monarchy under the sponsorship of a foreign government and culture, which is to say Persian in that case. And one of the things things we're going to look at here is, can Jacob, as Mr. Israel himself, as he'll be named after he leaves this, be able to leave without carrying too much of the Mesopotamian culture with him as he takes the daughters and the cattle with him as he goes, or at least the goats and sheep. So let's look briefly at the aspects from Hatanen's book here, and this just came out in 2021, and it's a 670-page book. And as my old friend Marilyn has said about the work I've been doing over the last 30 years that she and I have known each other, thank you for reading these books so I don't have to. So I went through this scholarly, it's more than a monograph, it's a monument here to all that can possibly be known, and recently too, just a couple of years ago. So I want to highlight just a couple things, and I'll post this again on Radical Bible, and you can read it in more detail. So some basic things related to our passage. So the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian sources describe the moon god Sin as a deity able to endow kingship, to protect the king, and to secure his reign. So monarchy as an aspect of at least the hidden part of our story is there. And then more importantly, fertility. The moon god Sin bears the appellation fruit around the monthly renewal and growth. So no surprise it's connected with women's fertility. And we'll see that in implicit ways and explicit ways, but with Jacob staying with Laban for a month here, which is in English what the word really means and what it meant in Hebrew as well. So associated with renewal and growth, creating abundance in the land, but especially as the paternal authority in the household, which consisted of wife, children, and servants, exactly what we see here, but also connected with the sheepfold, with cattle and sheep, especially horned animals like cattle, connected around the idea that the crescent moon, as you can see from this symbol, has two horns. And so the moon god Sin and his wife, and another a god related to light, become the Trinity, if you will, in Haran. And so we can see that here, like the moon's horns, the sheepfold, together with the Sumerian word here, cattle pen, have both celestial and pastoral connotations. And then finally, in terms of worship, there's an element in which, as our author here notes, that there's a transfer from southern Mesopotamia to the north, which is to say from Ur to Haran, as a product of commercial connections or political ties, although no direct evidence for such a transfer exists. I'm going to highlight that because, as you've been noting, Haran is the farther northwestern outpost of the Babylonian Empire. So sending Jacob back to Laban there is certainly engaging the exilic experience. The temple of the moon god in Haran was known by the name in Akkadian, Ahul, meaning house of joy. So not just an angry god, but much joy associated with this worship in this place, as expressed through the festival of the moon god Akitu, which involved the celebration of the return of the city's deities from the Akitu house back to the city. And as the note says here, because Haran was an important military garrison, they wanted to indicate the protection there. And there's finally a long inscription. This is not from that book. This is from Gad, cited from the excellent Wikipedia page, which has more footnotes than I've seen any other Wikipedia page has. So it's actually a very solid page. Describes a stele inscription that the king's accession to the throne here is at the will of a different name of the moon god, so associated with monarchy there at the end. So all those elements give us a great framework here for understanding what our authors are doing as we enter into this story. So with no further ado, let's see how that plays out as we go. So I left up the last verse so we can just see where we were as we enter in our section here. So when Laban heard the news, this phrase is only here. There's a wordplay in Hebrew here because we can hear it's two versions of Shema in a different form. So lost in the translation is when he heard the hearsay. But as I was noting last time, there's still no direct speech between any of these characters. There was a direct speech between Jacob and the shepherds, but Jacob kisses Rachel without even introducing himself, and only the narrator is telling us about what's going on, that Jacob told Rachel this and that she told her father. But we don't know verbatim whether it's the same or not, and it's very different than the narrative approach in chapter 24, where we first heard Abraham make his servant promise certain things, and then we hear it retold in the long chapter 24, where he's standing there or sitting there at the well watching what Rebekah's going to do, and then he tells it to Laban in the house. But here it's all an indirect speech, and it's interesting that it's reduced down to this level. Partly, I'd like to suggest that Jacob is not as alert as the elder servant was that Abraham trusted to send there to negotiate with Laban. Despite the effort by his parents to have him practice this by lying to his face to his father in chapter 27 about the blessing, he's not prepared at all, as we're about to see. So she ran and told her father, and he will run out there and reply, echoing Rebekah's running and Abraham's running when the guests were there. So running runs in the family. So he heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, and that's all we hear that he's told, and that's all that we understand that Jacob told Rachel. So it's this simple fact that there's a relative at the gate. And interestingly, it says he ran to meet him, or literally to call him, and embraced him and kissed him. The embracing is only in 2 other places here, and they're all involving Jacob. This is the return here with Esau, and this is with Joseph and the grandchildren there. And kissed him, matching Jacob's kiss. And again, is there consent in this direction? Neither way is there consent as far as we know. There'll be a kiss denied, which is to say Laban will complain he didn't get to kiss his children goodbye, his grandchildren goodbye, and it'll be regained at the end of the chapter. And then it says he brought him into his house. But interestingly, when you look at art of this scene, and here's one example, I could not find any art of this scene that was in a house. It's all outside or in a tent like this one suggests. But there's nothing that shows what the text actually has, that this conversation that follows will be in the house. And still in indirect speech, Jacob told Laban all these things. But what all these things? Did he tell him anything else beyond what Rachel told him? Because all we know that Jacob has told Rachel is this one thing, that he was her father's brother there, and that he was Rebekah's son. So what else is Jacob telling him besides what Rachel told her father? We don't know. Is he repeating it just for confirmation? So all of this indirect speech to not say very much, and finally we get direct speech here. So as my note has, Laban can see that unlike Abraham's servant, Jacob comes empty-handed. Rather than gold or silver, he can offer manual labor. And there's much going on in this little exchange here, and what follows in the next verse, that ought to have alert readers paying attention to what we heard and learned in Genesis 23, with Abraham negotiating with the Hittites over the burial place that became the family burial tomb, the cave of Machpelah. Jacob, of course, didn't experience that. It happened before he was born. And Isaac didn't experience it either because he wasn't there. So Jacob is not prepared, as far as we know, to negotiate with someone from the old country. This is his first visit, as far as we know, and encounter with anybody outside his own family. That seems unlikely, but that's as far as the text has told us. So Laban is wily, and we should know that. And so we have to read carefully between the lines of what he's saying here. So surely you are my bone and flesh. So that can be read as a question or as an affirmation, as many scholars have noted. But the phrase bone and flesh here echoes not only Eden, but is in my chart of Laban and his daughters. It's echoing, as we see here, what we heard when David becomes king and all the tribes of Israel say to him, we are your bone and flesh. And precisely what's going to be at issue are Israel and Judah of the same bone and flesh? Whether they take that literally, as this story is presenting, as children of the one father Jacob, or metaphorically, as anthropologists would call fictive kinship, the same way that Americans can refer to Washington and Jefferson as founding fathers, even without any kind of blood relationship. So all those things are at issue here, in whether Laban is saying, yes, you are, or I wonder if you really are. And that's part of the note down here that says it's more ambiguous than it sounds. Is apparently an open-hearted admission that Jacob is indeed Laban's close relative, taken as a warm welcome to Jacob to stay. However, the term here may suggest a rather grudging admission on Laban's part of kinship. You've convinced me that you are my nephew, so you may as well stay. On this view, Laban's double dealing is already being hinted at, even though Jacob must have understood the comment entirely positively and be reassured by it. We don't know that Wenham's point there is how Jacob understood it, but it's certainly well possible here. As I note here as well, Jacob has to get past the first bone and flesh, which is, say, the father of the bride, and then the encounter between families, which is to say the nations of Israel and here of Aramea here, shows how self-interest can conflict and lead to opposition. So he stayed with him a month. And notice there's no response to this. Jacob told Laban all these things. We don't hear a word out of Jacob's mouth. Laban says this, and he stayed with him a month. But what's happening during that month? Is what we hear in verse 15 after the month? Or is it right immediately in this immediate scene, and the month is going to transpire as time goes by? That's ambiguous here. But if we take it as the immediate scene, because there's no sense of anything that distinguishes it here, Laban said to Jacob, and this is highly ambiguous, and it works just like we saw the Hittites say with double negatives. And the English is a good translation here in most ways to highlight the ambiguity of what he says. Because you are my kinsman, or literally my brother, should you therefore serve me for nothing? And notice how convoluted that is. If you try to think hard about it, it's not clear exactly what is the question. And that's what's at issue. As Sarna notes here, the question could be a repudiation by Laban of the formal recognition of the ties of kinship. Henceforth, Jacob would have the status of hireling. So is it, you are my brother, or are you my brother? He's said, you are my bone and flesh, and that was ambiguous, and he's repeating it again, perhaps right after or perhaps after a month isn't clear. But the word for serve is slave, and we see it many times. Here I left it as serve, but it could well be translated as slave here, and it's a theme throughout. And as my note below has, Laban must have sensed the strong worker with the story of Jacob's lifting the stone from the well, assuming that either Rachel or Jacob told him about that. If Jacob told him about that, Laban might wonder why he came in immediately violating the cultural norms so rudely like that. But it could certainly perceive, Laban could perceive by that Jacob was strong. And the irony that the mama's boy who was by the tent with a testosterone-fueled act of strength of lifting the lid off the well, does that signify that he's strong or he just had a moment? Isn't clear yet, but that's Laban's only evidence so far. So serve me for nothing, Hinnom here, only here in Genesis, but it's in Exodus around the question of the conditions of Hebrew slavery. So having asked the rhetorical question and not listened for an answer, he says now, tell me, what should your wages be? So he's answering his own question, which to say, you won't be my slave. Because you're my relative, I won't make you be my slave. But I'm also not going to be hospitable to you for nothing. You're going to work for me, and I'm going to treat you like a worker. So that's the question. And notice he doesn't offer it as an exchange for a wife. He doesn't know yet at this moment, unless Rachel told him about the kiss, that Jacob's interested in his daughter. He's just hanging around and for a month eating free, apparently. So now the question is, you're going to have to work for it. And the narrator intervenes here to give us some interesting information, and it could be easy to go over verse 17 quickly, but I want to pause on it because it's important. So Laban had 2 daughters. He also has sons, but they're not relevant to our immediate scene. The name of the elder, but really it's greater and smaller. Like chapter 1 in Genesis, the sun and the moon, the 2 lights for the day and the night. So the sun, in that case, is Leah, the greater, and the moon, Rachel, is the lesser, even though Laban, with the name white, is an epithet for the moon itself, for the full moon, not the crescent moon. And we saw this just earlier around the stone, the greater and greater stone that we saw, and the greater daylight. So Leah is among several things that are considered great so far. Leah, as Sarna notes, can mean, depending on the root, cow or strong woman or mistress. Certainly you wouldn't name your daughter cow, but as I noted in the aspects of the Mesopotamian god Sin, that the sin is associated with cattle, and with cows in particular. So it could make sense that even though to our ears cow sounds like an insult to name your daughter that, we certainly know that calling a woman a cow, in my cultural context at least, is not a compliment. It may well be in Leah's because of the connection with sin. And the name of the younger was Rachel, which we've already seen means ewe lamb, and so she's out there with the sheep, meaning ewe lamb. And then we hear this, Leah's eyes, and this is in the dual form, which is usually what eyes and ears and nostrils are about, that come in pairs, like feet. But Jensen argues in his 2018 article that here it refers to appearance, not to the eyes themselves, but to what that is seen. So that when one sees her, she's whatever this word is. It's translated lovely here, but notice how many different translations of this word can mean. Rakoth, which literally means soft. but it can be like tender meat, as we saw what was offered by Abraham and Sarah to the visitors there, as frail children, and Jacob's excuse for why he's not going to continue to walk with his brother Esau, and elsewhere for soft or weak, and so we see other translations as tender, clouded, or weak. And depending upon your perspective, obviously weak or clouded eyes is not a positive thing, but tender or soft eyes might be. The Midrash explains it around her eyes as weeping over the arrangement. In other words, her eyes are clouded because she's not going to get the man that's there for her. So there's an ambiguity about what Leah looks like, or whether it's whether it's about her eyes or her overall body. But Rachel is described as beautiful and formed to look at. And the beautiful is associated with a number of things: Sarai, Joseph, Pharaoh's dream cows, the good ones, not the bad ones, with David, Abigail, Absalom, Abishag, and others. But the phrase here, Yafa Mera, beautiful in form, is for Sarai there, for Rachel here, for Joseph here, and then for David. And that's one of the key elements of the connection here, that Rachel and David are paired there as well. So that's one that I just added. And so then we hear the narrator adds another thing, and there's a little tiny chiasm here around 18 to 20. I won't do that now because we're only going to go through part of it now. But we hear that Jacob loved Rachel. And love is not a common word in Genesis, but we hear at the very end that Isaac loved Rebekah as he enters his mother's tent. We hear it here, and we also hear it for Abraham's love of his son Isaac. As Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg notes, there seems to be a natural progression here from Abraham with his two wives to Isaac, who is monogamous but has a servant for a matchmaker and who loves his wife only after marriage, to Jacob, whose love is self-chosen and filled with an energy of intentionality. But of course we don't know anything about Rachel's intentionality in relation to that. So he offers Laban a proposal. I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. And I note that 7 is also an important number in the Babylonian culture, the Shapatu, from which the Hebrew idea of Sabbath comes as a quarter of the moon cycle. So he's injecting this 7 in here out of nowhere. It's completely arbitrary. He could have said 1 year or 2 years or 20 years, but he picks 7, and it fits the overall understanding that this scene is suffused with Babylonian imagery throughout. So he offers 7 years of basically involuntary or voluntary servitude for your smaller daughter Rachel. And as my note has, is he suggesting he's modest? I don't want the great daughter, I'll just take the smaller daughter. Is he engaging any kind of indirect negotiation, much like Abraham was with the Hittites? Or is he just naming the one he's after? But plainly, Jacob does not have a lot of negotiating skills here, because I'm sure we know that he's going to end up there not just for 7 years, but for 20 years before he's done. So our immediate scene ends here with Jacob agreeing in a certain way. Notice he doesn't say yes. He says it is better, or it's good, Tov, that I give her to you, that I should give her to any other man. Notice how close that is to the Hittites not saying they would actually sell anything to Abraham. And a superficial reading of chapter 23, as I often experience from students who weren't trained in this in my college context, that I don't understand why they're still arguing. Didn't they already agree? But that's the point of understanding the cultural context. So he hasn't actually said anything. He hasn't said, yes, I'll give her to you. He just says it's better to do that than to something else. But he hasn't agreed, and that's the point that Jacob doesn't get, and that's the point on which he will be caught, as we'll see next time. So for now, he says, stay and remain with me, and as Gene Som suggests, forever. So we'll stop there, and we'll see how Jacob has put himself precisely in Laban's trap next time. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.